Hey guys, what's up? Today I'm going to be showing you how I took this old junk fir framing lumber and turned it into a big 7x4 dining table. For the glue up of the top, my camera wasn't working properly that day, but it was pretty straightforward. I just used biscuits, glue, and a lot of clamps. I'll do a more in-depth video in the future of jointing and gluing a top. After the glue dried, I cut the table to 6 feet, and there was a 6-inch return board going on each end, giving the table a final length of 7 feet. Next I started prepping the return board. All the lumber for this build was old fir framing lumber, with most of the nails and staples still in it. After all the nails and staples were out, I took it over to the jointer to square up the one edge. After that, I set my table saw to 90 degrees and ripped the return board to 6 inches, the same width as the boards used for the top. I then took my return board to the end of the table and laid out where I wanted to put my biscuits. I put the end ones 3 inches away from the edge so that when I cut the table to the final width, I didn't cut through the biscuits. Then you would see it on the edge. You could also use wood dowels or dominoes and it would work just the same. The glue up process for the return boards is similar to the main table glue up process. I put lots of glue on the edges I wanted to join and in the biscuit holes. Getting some help for any glue up is a good idea. We used 2 long clamps on the top and 1 on the bottom. To counteract any lift up from the clamps, we used 2 blocks of wood and 2 clamps at each end to keep it flat. While that was drying, I cut up some metal plate for some extra reinforcement to connect the returns, also to keep it from cupping in the future. I don't recommend using your finger as a clamp though. I then used the drill press to pre-drill the screw holes, cleaned up the edges also, and then gave it a quick coat of black paint. I set the plunge router depth to 3/4 of an inch so that the 1/2 inch steel plate would be completely hidden. Make sure to do slow passes with the router and make sure not to work it too hard by taking too much wood out at a time. With my drill, I pre-drilled all the holes before screwing in the plates. This is a good practice to prevent splitting in the wood when you're drilling into it. The next step was to cut the table to its final width. I got out the trusty track saw with the long track and ripped each side to a final width of 42 inches. Before cutting, it's also smart to mark it and take a measurement across from each diagonal. If the table is square, the measurements will be the same. This top was too wide to fit through our planer, so I started the long process of sanding all the high points and joints. I was accurate when biscuiting and gluing, so the joints weren't too bad, but fir is a hard wood, so it wasn't too quick of a process, but I managed to get it really flat. I started with 60 grit on the belt sander, then went up to 100 grit with the square pad sander. I prefer this sander over a random orbital sander just because the orbital tends to leave swirl marks more. I left it sanded at 100 for now and do a final finish later. Next I started making the stretcher board that would connect the 2 legs together. I took 2 pieces of 2x8 to the jointer. I jointed the face on both boards, which got it perfectly flat and ready to glue. I glued these 2 bad boys up, put some clamps on it, and let it dry. After the glue dried, I did the same process with the outside of the stretcher board. I jointed one edge and one face. Then I took it to the table saw to cut it to its final width of 3 inches. After that, I took it to the planer and got the last face planed down to get the stretcher board to a perfect 3x3. This process ensures a perfect square board. After that, I took the stretcher board over to the miter saw and squared each end. I like to tape my final cuts to prevent blowout and splintering from the saw. Attaching a piece of plywood to the fence works well too. I knocked off the edges and gave it a quick sand before starting the base layout. I marked center on each of the boards and then lined up those marks to make sure my stretcher board was at the exact center of the angle legs. I also traced the outside to make laying out my dowels easier. I'm using 2 half-inch wood dowels to connect these two pieces. So I found center of the traced area and then marked 3/4 of an inch from the top and the bottom. I did the exact same layout on the stretcher board. This is really important to be accurate because if you are off at all, one board will sit higher or lower than the other, which would not look good. The next step was to take the boards over to the drill press, and I drilled them with a 1/2 inch Forstner bit. I couldn't put the stretcher board on the drill press because it was too tall, so I had to use a drill with a spade bit, and I used the other board as a gauge to keep the bit straight. I did a quick dry fit with the dowels to make sure everything lined up nicely. I did the same thing with the angled leg components, which I had made up previously. I cut the legs at 7 degrees, which I thought looked the best. Before gluing up the legs, I gave them a sand up to 100 grit and knocked off the edges as well. I started by gluing all the dowels into their holes, and then put glue on the outside of the dowel as well, and then the surrounding area where the 3x3s would connect together. To help with even clamping pressure, I cut some shims at 7 degrees, the same as the angle of the legs, and taped them to the outside where the clamps would sit, so when I clamped together, the clamps wouldn't slide. For added strength in the legs, I added 2 trim head screws on the underside of the legs, connecting the horizontal piece to the vertical piece. I probably didn't have to do this, but I like my table strong. Next, I glued the legs to the stretcher board. Same process as gluing the legs together. I made sure to wipe off any excess glue right away, as it's harder to get off later. I also added some trim heads on the underside, connecting the stretcher to the legs for more rigidity. After that, I now started the tedious process of doing a final sand on the whole base. I went to 120 grit, then 150 grit, and a final pass by hand. I always do my last pass with a block and sandpaper, just to make sure I get out any swirl marks or inconsistencies left by a power tool. I made the base so that there was a 12-inch overhang on each end. I made sure the ends were exactly even and then split the difference on the sides, so it was sitting exactly in the center of the top. Once I had it where I wanted it, I traced out where the legs touched the top, so I could lay out where my dowels were going to go. I made a mark at exactly center of where I traced the leg for where my dowel was going to sit. After I had my layout done, I took my 1/2 inch Forstner bit and drilled a hole into the top. I put a piece of tape as a depth gauge at 1 inch so that I didn't go too deep and pop through the top. That would not be good. I did the same procedure into the top of each leg on the base. I did a quick dry fit with the dowels in, and then I was ready to start filling. The lumber had a few knots and cracks in it, that I didn't want food to get stuck in, so I used a natural fir wood filler that I've used on a lot of other projects, and it works great. I let that set up for about an hour and then sanded it off with my pad sander. After that, I went over the edges of the top with a 1/8 inch round over bit, always going from left to right, opposite of direction the bit is spinning. If you go with the direction the bit is spinning, the wood could burn, chip, splinter, or your router might jump. After that, I took my pad sander and went over it with 150 for the final sand. Then, like I did before, I took a block and a piece of 150 sandpaper for the very last pass of the top. For this table, I used the product called Rubio Monocoat 2C oil and the natural stain. To start, you need to do a 3:1 ratio of the stain to the accelerator. You don't need to use the accelerator, but it makes the drying times way faster. A handy way of getting this ratio bang on is to use a paint syringe. I did a 120 ml of stain to 40 ml accelerator. Gave it a good stir and it was ready to apply. I started to apply the Rubio on the sides first. I went around the whole thing, slowly massaging the product into the wood. After I went around the whole table, I let it soak in for about 10 to 15 minutes before I started to wipe off the excess. Once the sides were done, I started on the top. I poured a bit out and then used a plastic spreader tool to push the product over the table, carefully spreading it out evenly, making sure it covered everywhere. As I'm doing this, I'm also making sure that I don't have any runs going down the sides that could stain. Like earlier, I started with massaging the product into the table with a blue shop towel and let that sit in for about 10 to 15 minutes. After that, I took a microfiber to wipe off the excess and to buff it in. You can use a buffing pad on a machine which works just as good, but this is what I had. And that's all you have to do, one coat and you're done. It leaves a nice matte finish. And I like this product because it's super durable and resistant to everything. It's originally a hardwood floor product, but a lot of people use it for furniture as well, just because of how good it is. For the base, I just repeated the same process. It was a little more tricky because it wasn't a flat surface, but it worked out great. A few days later, after everything was cured, I went and started getting ready for the final assembly. I glued in the dowels that sit in the base. After those dried, I flipped the table upside down and then made sure everything was still fitting perfectly. I didn't glue the base to the top. I just put 2 toe screws into each leg. Me and the client decided to do it this way just in case they ever had to take the top off for transporting or for fitting through a tight area in the future. And here's the final product. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to my channel for more woodworking videos coming up soon. Thanks.